Hello and welcome to this review of my HP 264 keyboard. I've had this one for a while now, but I only just got to covering it. It was proxied to me via Ben, my long-term supporter, and it's actually a pretty interesting specimen. The HP 264X family was a series of ASCII terminals released in 1974. It retailed starting at $3,000, but many later versions were significantly more expensive. It came with a massive 1 kilobyte of RAM, so it was quite a powerhouse, almost as good as a toddler with an abacus. Nonetheless, it was very successful, and getting hold of one of these isn't that difficult despite of how old they are. I have no idea what vintage this particular one is, because I couldn't find anything that looked like a date code in here, but apparently they kept making computers in this family up until 1985, so 11 years in total, which is pretty long-lived. The terminal itself had some pretty interesting quirks, such as being widescreen, which was rather unusual at the time, but just the look of the keyboard alone should be enough to tip off that there's more than just that going on with this thing. Uncommon features of the keyboard itself include these two flip switches here in an inset that would originally have a cover on it. They allow you to set the duplex and the parity, whatever that means, and there's also a rotary baud rate selector switch with a rather wide range of speeds available. Next to that is a large block of slim special keys, some of which aren't even marked, but they are colourful, including a black, a green and a yellow one, plus a bunch of F keys with cyan legends of all colours, plus there are LED indicators in 3 different colours, red, amber and green, giving it a rather vivid appearance, especially for something this old and this beige. Apparently this keyboard was, at the time, noted for having a key for everything, I guess because a lot of the commands were context sensitive through on-screen hierarchical menus, and some of the keys were user customizable too. The top block also contains the caps lock key and a bunch of tape associated functions such as record, read and tape test, because this computer used mini tape cartridges, although later models came with 5¼ inch floppy drives instead, or in real world units 13.3 centimeters. I've seen one source claim that this is also the first keyboard with page up and page down keys. Well, next page and previous page, which is the key that should be here, but it's broken off. Anyway, I don't know if that's true, but I looked at a few of my really old keyboards, and I was surprised to see that indeed they don't contain those keys, so I guess it's possible. I removed the broken switch that was here, so we can take a look at it later in the video, and it's good for my personal switch collection, of course. Including the special keys, it's got 105 keys in total, which is quite a lot, especially for this period when keyboards tended to have relatively few keys still. As a result, it's fairly big, about 44.5 by 20 centimeters, or in very stable Genius units, about 0.28 washing machines, but it's not as big as, for example, a Model M, which kind of surprised me a little bit, because it looks like this should be way bigger than that. The build quality is, simply put, outstanding. I mean, not counting the 8.5mm thick cable, it weighs just under 3.3 kilos, which is massive. That's about the average imperial hourly human intake of fat and salt. The case is all plastic, but it's so unbelievably thick, I don't think it's going to break anytime soon. The top case is 6.4mm thick and the bottom 8mm. Plus, the assembly has a 1.25mm steel mounting plate and a 1.5mm aluminium backplate. It's incredible. What a monster. Also, it's got brass screw sockets. I like brass screw sockets. The switches are probably the most interesting part of the keyboard though. They are ITW magnetic valve in the original tall linear configuration. These are some of the most complicated and convoluted switches I've ever seen. They made the number 2 spot on my top 9 weirdest keyboard switch list video. I've previously done a review on a Zenith SWA 4300 keyboard with the later low-profile tactile version of these switches, which work using exactly the same principle, just in a smaller package. That video had a 5-minute, extremely in-depth explanation in it that I'll link to in the description below if you're curious about how these switches work. I'm not going to go into the same level of detail here, but basically it uses 2 disconnected circuit loops pulled through a ferrite core to induce a current from the drive line into the sense line, using an AC simulating DC pulse pattern. The induction is blocked by a strong static electromagnetic field in the form of a permanent magnet, in this case actually two magnets, which are positioned next to the ferrite core. These magnets are embedded in the slider, you can see them here, and the loops in the ferrite are molded into a single piece of plastic. The overall design is very reminiscent of micro-switch dual magnet Hall effect. You can use this system in both default high and default low configurations to scan for key presses, and I think ITW used both in fact. You may be wondering why on earth they made these so hideously complicated. But remember that this was patented in 1974. This was a time when they didn't really have any idea about what would work and what wouldn't, much less what would catch on. And so they tended to just try a bunch of random designs and see what stuck. This is why there are so many interesting switch designs from this early period, and why my channel tends to focus on vintage keyboards. Interestingly, despite the massive degree of over-engineering, these switches certainly weren't unsuccessful and stayed around for a long time, over 30 years. They were originally developed and patented by Illinois Tool Works, or ITW, and used chiefly by two companies, Cortron and Devlin. Cortron is a Massachusetts-based firm specialized in the fabrication of ruggedized data input solutions, mainly industrial and also military, including the Trident II multiple warhead nuclear missile launching system, so you can bet your ass they're serious about it. Devlin are a Basingstoke-based bespoke keyboard manufacturer who bought ITW's tooling for these switches and famously used these to make keyboards for the European newspaper industry until as late as 2005. Nowadays, they use Cherry MX instead. I contacted them a few years ago, but they had already disposed of everything by the time, unfortunately. In contrast to the low-profile tactile version, these are linear only and obviously much taller. They're also closed on top rather than opened. It's a very interesting design and should be extremely durable since it's contactless and it has no mechanical working parts other than the coil spring. The switches are kind of mid-weight and fairly smooth as long as you press them in the middle. They do bind a bit in off-center key presses. I should specify that this keyboard was in remarkably good condition, all but spotlessly clean, but it's still a 40-plus-year-old piece of hardware, so I imagine it probably doesn't feel quite as good as it did back when it was new. I mean, the fucker is older than I am, and let's be honest, it probably aged better than I did too. Really, apart from the slight binding issues, it doesn't feel bad to be honest, and they sound pretty nice as well. Although they do have a tendency to squeak just a little bit. Interestingly, some of the slim keys at the top use a latching variant which stays down with every other key press. You can recognize them by the follower loop located at the top of the housing. In my experience, latching switches are far less smooth than the normal variants and sometimes fail to latch properly, and indeed two of them have difficulty reliably unlatching, but the others work extremely well and all of them are remarkably smooth. It's really good, probably one of the best alternate action switches I've seen to date. Also, for no reason I can make out, there is a rogue Cherry M7 switch at the top left under this black key here. I've absolutely no idea what it's doing here, but it uses a bar mount that seems to be completely compatible with ITW's own cross mount. The keyboard, or should I say the keycaps, have yellowed a bit obviously, but it's not the worst I've ever seen. For reference, the 6 key appears to be a replacement, so this is probably what the rest of the keyboard should look like as well. It is possible to temporarily revert this yellowing using a gelled UV-activated peroxide bleaching method, but frankly I'm not going to bother, especially as I can't even use it on a modern computer. I'm sure it uses some sort of weird ancient protocol for communication, and the connector isn't exactly USB as you can see, so I'm just going to leave it as it is. Also, the keycaps may be ABS, as you'll probably have guessed by now, but they are double shot, which is the most durable type of printing, and they are thick as a brick. Jesus, camel fucking Christ on a tightrope. Look at this shit. Compare that to an OG Cherry double shot keycap, and it makes them look like little bitches. It's 2.65mm thick for reference, over a millimeter more than a Cherry cap, and of course they're uniprofile, and yes they are cross mount, but as you can see they're clearly not MX compatible. Being a 100 plus key keyboard, it does have some room to work with, and indeed it sports an alphanumeric block, a numpad and a nav cluster of sorts, although all of it looks slightly different from what we're used to. Most notably, the numpad and nav cluster are swapped around. But it's not too bad, although some of the modifiers could have done with being a bit bigger. I dare say the layout isn't that weird, and it could probably be adapted to modern usage without all that much difficulty. Overall, it's a really cool old keyboard, and a great example of some of the things they used to experiment with a few decades ago. The switches aren't bad either, but they're so old now that they're a bit past their prime, I think, and there are modern switches that do this concept better. Still, I like it, if only for the novelty. That's it for this review. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this keyboard.